epistles is from 1 Corinthians, Paul's word to Corinth. You can easily enough see how this kind of thing works by looking no further than your own body. Your body has many parts, limbs, organs, cells, but no matter how many parts you can name, you're still one body. It's exactly the same with Christ. By means of his one Spirit, we all said goodbye to our partial and piecemeal lives. We each used to be independently call our own shots, but then we entered into a large and integrated life in which he has the final say in everything. This is what we proclaimed in word and action when we were baptized. Each of us is now a part of his resurrection body, refreshed and sustained at one fountain, his Spirit, where we all come to drink. The old labels we once used to identify ourselves, labels like Jew or Greek, slave or free, man or woman, are no longer useful. We need something larger, more comprehensive. I want you to think about how all this makes you more significant, not less. A body isn't just a single part blown up into something huge. It's all the different but similar parts, arranged and functioning together. If foot said, I'm not elegant like hand, embellished with rings, I guess I don't belong to this body. Would that make it so? If ear said, I'm not beautiful like eye, limpid and expressive, I don't deserve a place on the head, would you want to remove it from the body? If the body was all eye, how could it hear? If all ear, how could it smell? As it is, we see that God has carefully placed each part of the body right where he wanted it. But I also want you to think about how this keeps your significance from getting blown up into self-importance. For no matter how significant you are, it is only because of what you are a part of. An enormous eye or a gigantic hand wouldn't be a body. It would be a monster. What we have is one body with many parts, each its proper size and in its proper place. No part is important on its own. Can you imagine eye telling hand, get lost, I don't need you, or head telling foot, you're fired. Your job has been phased out. As a matter of fact, in practice, it works the other way. The lower the part, the more basic and therefore necessary. You can live without an eye, for instance, but not without a stomach. When it's part of your own body, you are concerned with it. It makes no difference whether the part is visible or clothed, higher or lower. You give it dignity and honor just as it is, without comparisons. If anything, you have more concern for the lower parts than the higher. If you had to choose, wouldn't you prefer good digestion to full body hair? The way God designed our bodies is a model for understanding our lives together as a church. Every part dependent on every other part. The parts we mention and the parts we don't. The parts we see and the parts we don't. If one part hurts, every other part involved hurts, and in the healing as well. If one part flourishes, every other part enters into the exuberance. You are Christ's body. That's who you are. You must never forget this. Only as you accept your body, your part of the body, does your part mean anything. You're familiar with some of the parts that God has formed in His church, which is His body. Apostles, prophets, teachers, miracle workers, healers, helpers, organizers, those who pray in tongues. But it's obvious by now, isn't it, that Christ's church is a complete body and not a gigantic, one-dimensional part. It's not all apostle, not all prophet, not all miracle worker, not all healer, not all prayer in tongues, not all interpreter of tongues. And yet some of you keep competing for so-called important parts. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, my rock and my protector. Amen. What do you have on your mind this morning? I've already heard just a little bit of what is on people's minds. And the topic is football. Football seems to be on everybody's mind as we get closer and closer to the Super Bowl. In fact, I hear about how much people are talking about how much people should be paid, whether they should be drug tested now for marijuana or not, depending on what state they're in. There's all different kinds of talks about football. And it reminds me of when I was a little fifth grader in Farmers Branch, Texas. And I had joined the local football team called the Bengals. Now, the Bengals are a team that people know, I think, in Ohio, right? The Cincinnati Bengals, is that? Well, in Texas, no one had an idea when we were that little where the Bengals were at. So it was really quite interesting. And I remember going out for football practice for about a total of 2 weeks. It didn't take me very long to decide I didn't like football as much as I thought. So I would get out there and tackle and wrestle, and finally it came time for this one drill. We both, another kid and I, laid on the ground, and the coach threw us a ball. Plump. And then we had to jump up with the ball and run past the other one. Well, the ball landed in my lap, on the ground. I jumped, and before I even got up, I was already back on my backside. I was looking straight up in the air, and I saw the blue sky, and soon after my coach in my face. Real close, saying, "Do you want to play football or not? This is all about being together and blah, blah, blah." And I stood up defiantly and I said, "No, I don't." So I left, and I brought one little boy with me as well. There's a lot of armchair quarterbacking going on today, isn't there? Well, armchair quarterbacking didn't just start with football. In fact, wherever there has been communities, we have people that often know how to do it better. In fact, this was what was going on in Corinth. This is what Paul is addressing in the letter that we heard this morning. That there were people in the church that began to be puffed up with pride and began to exalt themselves about all their gifts and began to denigrate those who had different gifts. We have apostles. Now, does anybody know what an apostle is? We talked about this a little bit in our Thursday morning Bible study time. Does anybody remember what an apostle is? A follower. Actually, he's the opposite, or she's the opposite. She's a leader. An apostle is different from a disciple. A disciple is a student, but an apostle goes out and performs mission in an area that has not yet heard about Christ before. That's what is so significant about the apostles in the early church, as they actually went out to places like Corinth and Greece and Spain and India, and they shared all the good news that came from Christ. We also have teachers that are able to help us grow in the faith, that they take the time and sit with us when we are little and learn about what's right. And then when we're older in Sunday school and we're still talking about doing what's right. Isn't that amazing how this happens throughout our whole lives, that we have to continually keep reminding ourselves to do what's right? We find in today's lessons we talk about organizers and those who pray in the church, those who pray with tongues. Now, today, we don't generally pray in tongues, but it's good to remember those who pray. That they have a function here in our church. We have our prayer chain where we communicate